All right, welcome to AHA with Amplify. I'll let people start rolling on as they grab their lunches and start a new season with us. While we get people coming on, I will let you know what's going on with Amplify. So this is our kickoff to our brand new season of AHA with Amplify. For those of you that are members and have been with us for a few years, you'll know that each September we start off a new season and we have webinars at noon on the third Tuesday of each month. It's a very exciting program that we've been running for, this is our third year, and we're very excited about the things that are coming up. So again, AHA with Amplify is a webinar series that we provide to business leaders and finance leaders, and it is the third Tuesday of each month at noon. We skip December, July, and August because we know everyone's holidaying and vacationing in December, July, and August, but every other month we provide this learning opportunity. It's a great CPD opportunity for our CPA friends, and we do give certificates within the week of attendance if you happen to attend live. And it's a great opportunity for the growth-minded community of business leaders that we serve, where they can also attend live, but can also look at the videos after the fact. So very excited to have you here. If you're not a subscribed, signed up member of AHA with Amplify, please do make sure that you sign up. The other thing that we provide, besides the lunch webinars every third Tuesday, is in-person networking and learning events. But those are generally sold out and exclusive to AHA members. So be sure to become a member and sign up. And I'll have Nikki put the link for signing up for AHA with Amplify in the chat box so that you can do that if you have not yet signed up as an AHA member. Our next in-person live event is definitely going to sell out, and it's going to be touching on transactions, the economy, and finance. And we're very excited to welcome back some of our favorite ebook co-authors. We wrote a book called The 5 C's of Lending, which was a book about financing for business leaders. It was written during COVID and updated during COVID, and we'll be sure to share that in our email to AHA members if you want to revisit it. So Danilo from Pillar Capital, Chad Dell from National Bank, and OT from his own entity are all joining me again. They helped me write the book, and we're going to have a really, really intense discussion about financing and transactions. We're also going to have a fireside chat with OT and our client Caltech and our CFO that served that client, and talk specifically about a transaction and the success we had together, Caltech as the business and Amplify as the CFO services, and then OT in the area of corporate financing. So very, very excited to share a real live example at the fireside chat and then continue on with the panel. That's October 26th. And in order to register, you need a password. And in order to get the password, you need to be an AHA member. So be sure to sign up if you're not already a member, and you'll be seeing that email invite coming out very soon. Other things that are coming up with AHA with Amplify. Next month, October, we're going to be looking at data analytics. We're very excited to be presenting about Power BI and other alternatives and ways that you can practically bring that into your business and use the data that you have better. So very excited about our October session. November, we're touching on cyber. We all know that we can't have too many updates when it comes to cyber because it's changing so regularly. So every year we be sure to provide cyber education to our AHA members, and that's going to be November this year. December, we're skipping because of the holiday season, and we'll be back in the new year in January talking about indirect tax. So those are just some of the examples of what we're going to provide to you this year, and we're very, very excited to do so. Amplify believes in enhancing communities and amplifying opportunities and cultivating connections, and AHA with Amplify is a complementary learning opportunity that helps us serve that purpose. And we really appreciate the members that participate and engage with us. And if you have any feedback, we also would love to hear that. Without further ado, we're going to start this season with supply chain. What a hot topic. Very, very excited that we're able to touch on something that's so relevant to so many of our business leaders and so many of our members. So supply chain is today's topic, and we have a great business affiliate that has partnered with us to help provide this important information to you. And I'll let him give further introduction of himself. So Richard, thank you for coming. And we really do value your time today.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the Amplify community with information about the supply chain. So just a quick introduction. My name is Richard Veneris. That's like generous, but with a V. And we are from a business called Scalable Partners, and we provide what we call scalable supply chain support to match exactly the need of typically medium-sized businesses in that 50 million plus zone. And our presentation today is about the interface between supply chain and finance. I myself have worked in the supply chain for more than 20 years. Originally, I practiced law and supported procurement groups. And since then have specialized in this area of supply chain, including all the pertinent types of functional areas: change management, project management, dispute resolution, and most recently collaboration as a methodology, which is why you'll see this theme here that is actually painted onto my wall with the lime green background to make a point. So I thank you for coming today, and I will start with the content and sharing my screen. Throughout this presentation, you will see several polls, and there's a few opportunities for Q&A that Jamie will manage. And so you can put questions into the chat about whatever. In my view, you can put them into the chat whenever you like, and they'll kind of be saved up for the Q&A slides or points in this presentation where we've got some Q&A slides. And the polls are really about questions about the content and how it relates to your experience as finance leaders for your clients. So starting out with that, the most of the interest in supply chain, I find anyway, from finance leaders, and I should say, generally speaking, finance is oftentimes one of the departments or functions into which a supply chain function or a procurement function will report into. Typically, it's into finance or into operations, and sometimes, but rarely, it's its own. It's sort of big enough to have a chief procurement officer, but and has its own sort of hierarchy. But many times, you as a finance leader might have a supply chain or procurement flowing into you, and certainly around the payment piece. So one of the things that has become very prevalent in sort of the industry conversation online anyway, and in coffee chats and things like that, is that we live in a much more volatile world. I'd say, obviously the inflection point was sort of COVID, at least here in the Western world. But there's this notion of what's called the VUCA world, which many of you may have seen. This is pretty sure out of Harvard, this terminology. But things are, the supply chain, applying it to the supply chain, far more volatile. There's a lot more uncertainty. Things are way more complex. And there's a lot more ambiguity. So as a steward of your organization, a finance leader, certainly you're seeing or feeling this VUCA world with this constant uncertainty and risk. And so part of our presentation is going to be about sort of how you're going to deal with that with supply chain as a partner. So now, often we're dealing in the Amplify world and in the scalable world, we're dealing with medium-sized businesses. And medium-sized businesses, generally speaking, in my view, are really quite vulnerable to the global context. So supply chain, all these disruptions, these are happening at a global level. And so there's this maelstrom of change and geopolitical conflicts, which are in the news every day. There's very recently tons of strikes and lockouts, whether it be in BC at the ports. There was a number of rail strikes or pending rail strikes, which are threatening to blow up the logistics of a large number of activities. Certainly, with climate change and a bit more extreme weather events that are having impact on transportation networks. Inflation has been a big thing recently, although our inflation rates, I think, are quite low compared to high for us historically, but low compared to a lot of other countries that are much worse. The cost of energy is going up, especially with the race to electrify as much as possible, and it's creating shortages in terms of labor and material for the electrification or for the greening of energy, generally speaking. And then you'll have occasional, very logistics specific things happening: container shortages in China, port congestion in India, things like that. That really, a small or medium-sized business is you just have to live with it. I mean, it's just waves and waves of change that are sort of breaking over your business. And so there's really very little the average organization can do to address these things, except to be well poised to deal with them. And they're just sort of keep happening in quick succession. So that's part of our conversation is, how does finance and supply chain work together, or how can supply chain help the finance functions or finance leaders deal with these generally inevitable disruptions as they come, and how do you come out ahead or preserve value for your clients in the face of all this that you can't really prevent. So there's a quick poll here, basically just testing for this particular group to see whether you've experienced a supply chain disruption. So I'll give you a few minutes here. I'll just let you digest the question and answer. I can't vote, by the way, but I would tell you it would certainly be yes.
Can you see the results, Richard?
I can see a poll. I cannot see the results.
Okay, perfect. I will give them one more second here, and then I'll end the poll, and that's when I think everyone can see them. Okay, last chance. 80% have participated, so.
That's a good metric.
All right. And I've shared the results, or I believe I have.
Okay, good. So we're looking at a good 3/4 of entities that you're supporting right now have experienced some sort of supply chain disruption. So we're this is not an irrelevant topic. Let's put it that way. Okay, so then the next question, which is a bit more poignant, is so what did that cost you? How much did it hurt your client's business or the business that you're supporting right now? And I've got some sort of dollar amounts in the next poll in terms of just trying to estimate it. The reason I ask this, of course, is because everything's has to have an ROI. So if you're going to invest in the interface between supply chain and finance, then with a view to avoiding some of these costs, then it's good to know what these costs are.
All right, so launch the second one. Oh, I'm struggling with that. Keep rolling while we do this.
Okay. This is where I normally have a juggling act.
Oh, there we go. Sorry.
Okay, here it goes.
I stopped sharing the one in order to launch the second.
So this could be clients as well if you're working in more than one client in the last 3 years, which is quite probable in a fractional CFO finance leader context.
Very few of our attendees are fractional CFOs, Richard. So.
Oh yeah, okay.
Awesome. Okay, we've got 66% participate. So a couple more seconds, guys. All right, I'll end the poll here and share.
Okay, so we've got sort of equally, 1 million. I'm making notes, by the way. 1 to 5, and okay, and then of course there's a significant portion. So 2/3 are they know, and they range quite equally in those first 3 cost categories. Maybe some of the businesses took a bigger hit at 10 million or more. And interestingly, many people don't know. And one of the reasons could be that you've had disruption, but you don't know how much it cost you, which is unfortunate and not odd, really. I mean, things aren't going well, but putting a number on it isn't necessarily an easy thing. So great. Thank you for the feedback. Okay, moving on. There we go. So each of you may, as stewards of the organization, are responsible for finance. You could look at yourselves as a hero in the face of all this disruption. People are going to look to you as a leader and say, guide us, help us with this. What are you going to do, or what should we do as a way to respond? In many cases, just reaction, really. How do we respond? And so we're going to try to help you be that hero in the organization. So a healthy business from a finance perspective really has, guess, 3 major areas of inflow in terms of income or cash flow. So either you're getting it from your sales revenue, you're getting it from your investments, or you're finding what we call operational efficiencies. And that's a big word, but supply chain, that's the ROI for supply chain, tends to be located in this operational efficiency area. And it's somewhat in sales revenue insofar as operating margin or profit is concerned, if we can get better pricing. But generally speaking, we're in that operational efficiencies area. So that's where we're going to focus on in this conversation. So what are we going to do today, given this context? You've got supply chain disruption. We're trying to help you be that success point in your organization. And this is what we are going to do for the rest of the presentation to try to bring that about. So there's places where we can both protect value and also create value, where finance is meeting the supply chain management function. So we're going to give you a dose of supply chain knowledge. We're going to talk a little bit about where we believe that supply chain and finance can combine to protect and create value. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how an Amplify finance leader can work with us, scalable. Because we are trying to bring something different to the market, which really sort of aligns with my personal philosophy for our profession. And we're trying to do something different and better. So we'll get to that at closer to the end. So, supply chain is a very sort of complex network of processes and interfaces throughout multiple geographies. It is the backbone of most businesses. And despite that, it's oftentimes also kind of an area of mystery, really. In many cases, most organizations really only have partial control of aspects of the supply chain. And these are all the major processes, and each of them with their own stakeholders that someone will have to manage. So clearly, some kind of planning has to occur about what is going to be purchased. Then there's the interface to the world of suppliers, where you actually spend your money. You get inputs, whether they are physical or intangibles in the case of services and intellectual property. But you'll get something, and then that something has to be managed into a production process. And so we call that, in the supply chain world, materials management, where we're managing oftentimes the inventory and locations, and trying to optimize how much we're buying, not too much, not too little, that sort of thing, given demand and cost. Then typically the inventory goes into some kind of production, and there could be an inbound logistics to production, and there's oftentimes an outbound logistics leaving that production. And then you get into your sales context or revenue generating context, whatever that happens to be, whether it's bricks and mortar or something else in the nature of an online delivery. So, that's all pretty common or well understood. Then sometimes the sales don't go well, so you have to consider the reverse logistics, where things that are rejected by customers basically make their way back along that entire supply chain. And in there, running it all are certainly a bunch of people, and then you have various supply chain management systems and a whole bunch of information that you may or may not have your fingertips on if you are in a finance function. So there's a great deal of information, a number of stakeholders, multiple processes, just different geographies. It's just super complicated. And so what is supply chain management? Well, supply chain management is the discipline or the skill or expertise or the capability to manage all this, or manage as much of it as you can with the budget that you have. And so that's really what supply chain management is. The attempt to integrate information and action amongst all these various processes and stakeholders that exist within a supply chain. And I should say supply chain is not the same as value chain. In this case, for those of you who are also thinking about value chain, this is very much about a more physical concept. So you might have a supply chain function in your organization, or you might not, depending on its size, or you could have a number of people doing supply chain type activities. The way I like to describe it, in many medium-sized businesses, there's that whole analogy. I believe it's maybe a Buddhist philosophical parable, where you have a number of people touching an elephant and all of them trying to understand, one's got the tail, one's got the ear, one's got the side, one's got the tusk. And everybody's touching this elephant, but really no one knows what the elephant is or is aware of the other people on the other side of the elephant and all that sort of thing. So supply chain's a little bit like that, and particularly medium-sized businesses. So I find a lot of medium-sized businesses tend to have what we would call in our discipline a decentralized supply chain function, or a decentralized approach to managing the supply chain if it's not an actual function. So that means every business unit has somebody responsible. We've got that as a CPO, a chief procurement officer, but obviously it's not. It's just anybody who's doing procurement work. And each of these different functional groups, maybe it's based on product, maybe it's based on geography, they've got their own little supply chain going. They're all managing, they're all touching different sides of their own elephant in this somewhat disconnected way, and they're not really sharing information. They're not necessarily really aware of what other people are doing, certainly not on a real-time basis. And I find many organizations are set up this way. Now, if someone like myself, as you've met them, and they one of the pieces of advice you might get would be, well, you should really try to centralize some of this stuff so that there's a bit of command control and organizational level decision making. And so the next most common form of a supply chain function is this more centralized function, and that one might have a leader. You might have a director of finance, maybe manager. Sorry, a director or manager of procurement, typically. Or supply chain, and that person might have a group of people who are procurement experts, or maybe even just a few, and they kind of provide a service to the business unit. So the business units don't have the people who do this work. This centralized function has the people who do this work, and the business units are more customers of this supply chain function, and that's this middle one, centralized. And then if it becomes far more sophisticated, then it could be kind of center-led, which is where it's centralized to the point where the ROI on centralization starts to evaporate, in the sense is that there's just too much control. the thing is too big to manage from the center. You can't plan everything. And so you have to migrate some decisions, some capabilities back out to the business functions, but they use the center as its guiding post, almost like an advisory. It creates governance, it creates policies, best practices, training, and then enables each of the functions to do their work within, do the supply chain work within particular curbs on the road, so to speak. And that is a center-led function. That's probably the most sophisticated version of a supply chain function you'll see. So most organizations will go through a process as they grow. They will go from a decentralized to a centralized model as they move from a small or medium-sized business to a larger business. And this whole area is an area of also, there's tons of advice that's given in here, all sorts of transformation that takes place. And you know, it's a typical step in the maturity of this function as it moves from a decentralized to centralization over time. It is a natural aspect of a supply chain life cycle. So we will have a quick poll here while I adjust the lighting for my blinds, because I'm starting to get stripes. And I'll let Jamie run that poll, and you can tell me what you have experienced. Just a moment.
Perfect.
Okay, I'm no longer a tiger person.
All right, a good number of participants. Give you a few more seconds to push the button.
Again, clients could be multiple here, so that kind of makes the question hard to answer if different answers. So maybe go with an average.
No worries, not that many of the members that are attending have clients. So, all right.
Okay, good. So we've got a good mix of decentralized, centralized, and center-led. Okay, great. Thank you for providing that experiential piece. So we've got all three of the maturity areas and some where things are unknown. Okay. So what do you know, the average supply chain management function has there's a maturity model for just pretty much every kind of indirect. You know, finance has a maturity model. You know, HR has a maturity model. Procurement has a maturity model. All these you know, I don't want to say back office, but all of these support functions that might support a business unit tend to have some level of maturity, which is directly proportional to the amount of investment that's been made in that function. So you have you know, this ad hoc. Most of these assessments are based on the existence of processes and whether they're executed or not. So we tend to have usually in the smaller businesses, in our experience, tend to have a bit more of an ad hoc, meaning that's really just there's really no processes, just practices, people doing stuff, doing their best to talk to each other, but really it's nothing. It's kind of chaotic. So you know, sort of more small owner managed businesses in that situation. Then you have basic, where someone said, okay, hang on a second, we got to get some processes in place because no one, you know, we don't really know what we're doing. We don't have predictability. We should be getting consistent and you know, trying to get predictable in terms of the results that we're generating. So then sometimes some processes will exist. They're usually around buying things and conflicts of interest and ethical considerations, things like that. And authorities for purchasing things, and just to make sure the right people are ticking the right boxes, pressing the right buttons in terms of spending the company's money. So that's oftentimes where the basic processes exist. And people are accountable. Occasionally there's some internal auditing. But it's, you know, it's kind of hidden away. Then we start to move more into that centralized context, and where you have a higher level of maturity. And here you have what I would call structured. You have good processes in place rather than just ad hoc. You have most of the ones that are typically a good idea to have. Some of them are automated so that they're efficient. There's compliance, there's staff to ensure execution, to actually execute these processes. And so I would call this a structured maturity level. And then eventually that structured supply chain function will start to integrate effectively with other functions in a more formal way. And I would call that the integrated. So now the supply chain processes are mixing in with the processes and other functions. The operating partnerships are growing between organizations or sub-organizations within a company. And the joint success of this integrated effort is actually being measured. And then lastly, we've got optimized, where it's just perfectly run. They do case studies on it. You end up in the MBA class, like Walmart with its perfect supply chain and all that sort of stuff. Using cutting edge AI, you're using the best of lean and all that in terms of process optimization. So most small and medium-sized businesses tend to be in this basic or structured area, and eventually the larger ones that properly fund their supply chain areas tend to be more integrated. Rarely is there an optimized context because it's really quite expensive. If it's a supply chain oriented organization like a Walmart, for example, then that tend to have an optimized supply chain. So that's been our observations about maturity levels. So again, quick poll for the entities you've been dealing with. What maturity level have you seen in your travels abroad?
All right, 66% have participated, so give you a couple more seconds. All right. Okay, basic and structured. Okay, well, I'm not surprised. That was sort of met my expectations, so great. Okay, well, that helps me. Part of the reason I'm asking these poll questions, by the way, so I can tailor the rest of this presentation for you. So that is our next step. Talk about what is the result. So if many basic or decentralized supply chain organizations, or the organizations that have these kinds of supply chains, can have a lot of what I call supply chain pain. There are oftentimes you don't know where things are late and no one really knows when they're going to arrive. You can have situations where cost is just, this is its terminology in the supply chain world called cost leakage, where unmanaged transactions are just, they're suboptimal. So they're just leaking value out of the company like a leaky ship. Well, actually, that's the other way around. That's actually water coming out, coming into it. But I think you get my point. Oftentimes you have suboptimal excess inventory. Sometimes you run out of it because you're trying not to buy too much, and other times you have too much and no one really knows how much to buy. Suppliers can take you down. This is particularly a case when it comes to cybersecurity or in the green energy. Very, very, very common globally to have people going broke trying to supply green energy infrastructure because it's not quite mature yet. And the supply chain, like the people in all the suppliers in the chain, are not necessarily long. They haven't been around that long. And so some of them may make mistakes and they don't live. So that can come as a surprise. It can really damage a business if your supplier suddenly or key suppliers suddenly are unable to deliver. Typically, there's very little visibility into data, and so not great decisions are being made. If you're a leader in this kind of an organization, it's just embarrassing. All these things are going wrong. You can't really fix them. They're just happening to you, and you're just trying to deal. And it's a very reactionary context. Lots of yelling, a lot of stress, heart palpitations, stuff like that. I've seen it
Anyway, it's not a great place to be suffering supply chain pain. However, if you have a more mature, a bit more centralized supply chain function, you can get on top of this stuff. So you'll see a lot in sort of industrial press and literature where people will say, unlock the value of your supply chain. So that's why I have this this lock opened up here. But it's not really locked away. There's nothing hidden about it. It's right there. You just need to go get it. So if you have a mature centralized supply chain, oftentimes you just don't have the same problems with on-time delivery. Not, things don't necessarily arrive on time, but they don't stretch things out to a point where it's unretrievable. I've seen small businesses basically lose clients because they just couldn't source what they said that they could source. So they go in the market, it's just not there. Like it'll be 6 months, but I promised my client 3 months. Well, sorry, no other supplier. Well, sorry, I guess you don't have a project anymore. So that does happen. And so, you got to stay on top of that, got to be able to stay on top of that. And it takes a time and effort to do that. If a supply chain is very focused, most of them are measured on savings. And so obviously they're driving out costs like crazy, sometimes too much, sometimes to the detriment of relationships. If they're good at their jobs, they will have good relationships with suppliers, and suppliers can yank you out of the fire sometimes if it's necessary. Suppliers can become your strength, and you can beat your competitors because your suppliers are better. Sometimes disruptions can be a bit more predictable if you're out there gathering market data and you got your ear to the ground, so to speak. And so sometimes you can tell when these things are going to happen or before they happen, especially if your supply network is on your side, because they can tell it before you can. Oftentimes there's more data because there's systems in place, and data can be pulled out of systems and used to make optimal decisions. And then oftentimes it's much more auditable. You can survive an audit. You don't have an internal auditor coming along and saying, "Oh, this function's just malfunctioning all over the place," and you better get this fixed. So, and that's not great. I've been there too. So this is what the value that can be created by a well-functioning supply chain. So at this point, I just wanted to check in. Does anybody have any questions that they've popped into the chat that can be read back to me, and then I can answer them up, insofar as the content is concerned up until now?
Yes, thank you, Richard. So a couple of questions. We'll start with, when we look at the flow of the supply chain world, where do you see supplier risk management evaluations fitting in?
Well, that's typically happening if you look at it as from a process step. That's typically happening during the procurement portion. So you'll go into the market, you'll do something called a request for proposal, or RFX if there's request for information, request for quote, request for proposal, request for anything. And then you get responses, and part of your risk management will be to assess how risky, using hopefully a methodology, how risky each supplier is vis-a-vis the other suppliers. And then you would try to procure from the supplier with the least amount of risk. So that's one way to do it. Other forms are in terms of redundancy. You can have multiple suppliers providing similar commodities, so that if one goes down or is unavailable to you, or somebody else bought that commodity at a higher price, then you have a second to go to. So some people will do an allocation of business across 2 or 3, often not 3 because it splits you from a price marketing perspective, but they will do a redundancy strategy where you can have 1 or 2. And so you can manage price risk that way as well. Is that answering the question?
Yeah, I think it is. Thanks. If anybody has other questions, please feel free to include them, and I'll keep rolling with the others. So we saw what the poll said from a center, how often center-led was the way that supply chain was managed, and it wasn't very high with this member group. Is that representative of what you see, or what the overall business community would see?
Yeah, I mean, if you include all entities, let's just say it's all entities in Canada, just kind of manage, not boil the ocean. But typically the large organizations will tend to be center-led. I mean, so if you're looking at telcos, Rogers is going to be center-led. If you're looking at oil and gas, Suncor, well, I don't know if it still is because they've been hit pretty hard, but center-led, TC center-led, in the pipeline industry. So most of the larger companies tend to have a more sophisticated supply chain, and then they attempt to lead from the center. A lot of it is also based on trust. Some procurement organizations do not trust the other organizations to spend money correctly, and they'll tend to manage it too much. And so I find sometimes where an organization has the capability to move to center-led, the procurement department doesn't want to let that happen because it means that they're giving up too much control. So that's an organizational change consideration that doesn't necessarily have to do with maturity of the organization, just really about the relationship between the different functional units.
Right. So you spoke about how critical relationships are and how those people that are in procurement and supply chain often develop very strong relationships, and that can become a competitive advantage as a business overall in terms of profitability and meeting strategy. And I think that all of us, no matter how big of a companies we've worked with in the past, would echo that relationships are so critical. And yet at the same time, there's the balance of those relationships versus conflict of interest or nepotism or what have you, or
Yep.
or lack of values-based decision making, which can sometimes include lack of diversity or other bias, etc. So we know that that's one of the reasons that you take the formality of a procurement department supply chain and apply it to a more mature business. But then there's also those big businesses that we all work with, where at the core it's relationships, and that's where the true winning is, and that's how you keep getting the opportunity to provide value. But then there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape and admin, and you got to charge a lot more to serve those businesses, frankly, because they make it harder to work with themselves.
Yep.
So how, and maybe you're going to get to this throughout today's conversation, but how do you strike that balance? Because it's certainly complicated, and we see it in all size businesses of leaning into relationships, understanding where they matters, understanding how to develop trust in local, but having the right level of controls and the right level of admin and paperwork that doesn't drown your suppliers.
Yeah, no, that is one of the conundrums, like in the sense is that you need to make an unbiased decision, but to get to the unbiased decision, you have all this process, and this process needs to be there from a governance perspective, often gets in the way of relationships. So there's a number of best practices in this area to create that balance, and experienced practitioners know how to walk that line carefully. One of the biggest components to it, like every other governance function, is really just transparency. If you create a lot of visibility, people will see, they'll be like, well, I don't know about this interface here. That looks like there's some bias. Oh, okay, well, it's all here on paper. Like it's all visible to me. I can make a values-based decision on whether we're trading relationship for dollars here. So I think one of the best ways out of that whole conundrum, let's call it, is transparency, and transparency to the following of best practices. So if you got some rules and everybody agrees that those rules are ideal for managing this kind of a conundrum space, let's call it, where you can, you're kind of boxed in from multiple areas, you go with transparency. By being transparent, then you don't have to over process things. And so then you don't lay process over process over process to slow, and which causes the red tape and slows down, and can also have cost and as impact, as you say, and also relationship impact because people get frustrated. So I would say that would be probably the most obvious solution. So you have to have experienced practitioners, you have to have rules, you have to and have transparency to compliance with those rules. And then wherever you overstep or misstep, that's where trust comes in. Trust of other people trusting that you're not being biased, but really it is a good relationship. So, and that suppliers, if you need to pay suppliers a little bit more to deal with the bureaucracy, let's say, of governance, then you do that. They acknowledge that you're doing that. You acknowledge that you have too much governance, right? And so again, that's form transparency, honesty, and I think that's sort of, it's a subjective skills-based, experience-based kind of approach. But that would be, those would be sort of just quick words of wisdom. It's not as easy. It's easier to talk about it than it is to execute it.
Okay.
But yeah, that would be my response.
All right, we've got a couple more questions, but why don't we let you get back to it and we'll revisit those
Sure.
at the next check-in.
Okay, yeah, we still got plenty of time, and there's a Q&A at the end, folks. So if we build up more questions, we can keep going.
Perfect.
Okay, so just because of and thank you, Jamie. Sorry, I didn't thank you. So for this presentation, just because of time constraint, we're going to try to focus on procurement within the context of supply chain, and that's mostly because and procurement is where you're making your investment. Like you're making a commitment. This is where a lot of this ethical considerations that Jamie's talking about, or efficiency considerations, is a lot of this stuff happens at the point in this process where you actually buy, you actually commit to buy, and then you actually spend the money. So we're going to focus on procurement because money. Now. This sort of goes to this. I talked to you jokingly earlier about this unlocking the value of supply chain and so on and so forth. So that's very much a consultant speak and all that sort of stuff. But what I often like to do is get some kind of data, because we just don't have the resources at Scalable to do our own in-depth research with hundreds and thousands of respondents. So I always like to do things like go to a McKinsey study or something. So this is a McKinsey study. And they're basically saying if you have a good procurement function, your corporate performance is better, right? So they've got so a confidence level of correlation at 99%. They put an exclamation mark on it, almost like they're like, wow, the data is really good this time. And you can see, the procurement leaders, that might be the center-leds, the middle of the pack might be the centralized, but not integrated, and the procurement followers might be the folks that are very ad hoc or basic. And you can see under cost reduction, annual reduction of cost of goods sold is actually negative. So they're actually losing money by not having, by just following in procurement, but not leading. So again, you'll see that second column here, annual procurement savings. So just forget about the numbers, but the point is savings is the target. There are target savings. Every procurement function has them. If you're a finance leader or you're running a finance function and your procurement function has no savings target, that's probably going to result in no savings. So just understand that's the key metric. Okay. And then, of course, from a finance perspective, you want contribution to margin and to EBITDA. So all that is to say, a large consulting firm says that procurement is a source of financial health, and so it's worth the investment. So what does mature look like? So this is what I would call a typical life cycle, although it's not a cycle because it's a straight line. I understand the irony, but there are a number of steps that should be in place whenever you're engaging in some kind of procurement activity. And I want to focus your interest in the first two, data gathering and analysis. This is often not done. Okay, there's a whole world called spend analysis where tons of effort is spent trying to, going into the ERP systems and pulling out POs and invoices and trying to understand how much money we spend as an organization with what suppliers and what commodity types, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole science around this. And that information, your spending information, is supposed to inform your strategy of what's called strategic sourcing. Okay, strategic sourcing is where you buy things usually using tactics like RFPs and things like that, but informed with data, both market data and also spend data. I'm not talking about market data here because we just can't get into it, but you oftentimes will collect market data, merge it with spend data, and then use that to make your optimal procurement decision through a strategic sourcing effort, which you then implement using contract management, which is again a whole nother topic. And then you get into purchasing. So I wanted to indicate that there's a difference between sourcing and purchasing. Purchasing is after you've done your sourcing. Sourcing, you source a supplier, get contracts in place. Procurement or purchasing is oftentimes the transaction of issuing PO, making payment, issuing PO, making payments. It's mostly about systems, and it's mostly about matching and accurately paying. And in many cases, this stuff is highly automated. It's not there's nothing, you're not stopping anything in here. And lastly, once you're done with the payment, you're managing also performance of the supplier. And that's two areas, generally speaking. One is you're managing the suppliers against their obligations. Are they saying what they Are they doing what they said they were going to do in the contract? And are they performing? Are they doing a good job? And then at some point you get to the end where you've selected a supplier, you've bought from them, you've paid them, and you've assessed them, and then you're like, okay, after 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or whatever your cycle is, okay, are we going to keep doing this? Can we optimize this? And then you get into resourcing, which then not resourcing, but resourcing, which then brings us back into the effort to gather data. But now you tend to have more data because not only do you have data about spending in the market, you also have data about that particular supplier, and then you start all over again. So it's highly cyclical. Most procurement functions will every 3 to 5 years resource particular areas of spend, which are called categories, which again I can't get into because of time, but that's a discipline called category management. So if we get into the very, very specific, cannot spend too much time in here, but this is what I would call a 7-step process for sourcing. So this area here, the strategic sourcing one here, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer here, but that strategic sourcing chevron then breaks down into this whole area. So you do your data gathering and analysis. You develop a particular category so that you understand that category of spend or commodity area of spend. You do your strategic sourcing. You evaluate the supplier, and you don't evaluate. You create an evaluation methodology. Then you put that into your RFP. You issue it. Then you activate the evaluation methodology, and then you go through your negotiations, and then you implement the agreements. So you'll see at the bottom there, you have like this analysis and strategy setting, the actual procurement action that takes place, the contracting activity. Those are the 3 major things that happen within sourcing. Some of the interesting points to discuss here are, one, just sort of practice things. Obviously, if you don't do data gathering analysis or category development, you're sourcing blind, most cases, strategy is blind. What you try to do when you prepare for evaluations, this is a different topic, where you prepare for an evaluation, you look at your scope and your requirements, and you try to create what's called traceability of your evaluation criteria to your scope and your requirements. So someone will go and collect requirements. What do we want? What are we looking to buy? What is value? What is success? And we put that into, as professionals, we put that into the ask to the market, saying this is what we're looking for, and we're going to evaluate you on the basis of this. And so there's an art to this. It's a skill and expertise to get to this optimal supplier that requires a significant amount of planning and what I almost call research type activity, where you're trying to understand what are we trying to buy to get that optimal supplier in place and get that optimal product or service purchase in place. Negotiation is a whole other discipline. Some people, that's all they do. They really just do negotiations all the time. They don't even necessarily do the sourcing function. In many organizations, sourcing, in a more mature or large organization, the sourcing group or procurement group is separate from the contracting group, and they do what is a handoff. At the end of the RFP, the whole thing goes over to someone who specializes in contracts. So if you go and you'll see, contract specialist wanted, contracting expert wanted, contract manager wanted, that's a different discipline than the sourcing people. And they know how to draft contracts. Generally, they work with legal. They execute. They facilitate the execution of the contracts, and then they hold the suppliers to their obligations through some kind of KPI regime or governance framework. They manage relationships, hopefully, if they're good at it, and they manage change orders all over the place, amendments, extensions, things like that. That's what that group of people does. So this is, if each one of these, you'll get a copy of the presentation. We won't get into too much detail, but the idea is that all of these functions all this activity should be happening in a mature. Every single one of these line items ideally should be happening in some way every time you do some strategic sourcing. Now, it's not just about buying, however. That is a particular strategy, but there are multiple strategies, and you will be choosing strategies, or your sourcing or supply chain function should be choosing strategies. Some strategies are internal. Like if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, demand management, that means going back to the function and saying, do you really need to buy this? Do we really need to spend this money right now. The idea there, can we standardize that sort of thing? So the idea there is actually reduce the amount of internal demand versus simply taking the requirements and saying, yes, sir, I will go to out into the market and buy this for you. There's what are called volume concentration plays, is where you might try to merge a number of different suppliers amongst different geographies and or businesses in business lines into one or two suppliers that then serve the whole entity. It's very common to have a whole raft of suppliers providing essentially the same things, and there are advantages to concentrating that volume and then using that to get better pricing. And on the other side, there's the process improvement. Procurement is highly process driven, systems driven, very sequential in terms of the steps. You can't do X until Y is done, and you can't do Z until can't do Y till X is done. You can't do Z until Y is done. Very frustrating. And for clients, like the internal clients, quite frankly, a lot of paper, a lot of signing off on stuff just to make things move. So there's just tons of opportunity for lean, to apply lean principles and try to do process improvement and make the procurement function happen faster and at less cost, or to have, there's some metrics around, how much cost per person. If you have 50 buyers, how much should each buyer be contributing cost-wise to the business? There's all sorts of metrics around that. So there's a number of strategies that don't involve a market interface, which is what we're talking about. Interface back to the business, a concentration of the supply base into a smaller amount of suppliers, and or process improvements, in addition to the types of things we were talking about before, we do RFPs and use competition to drive price down, or use relationships to optimize performance. So, on that topic, if you're trying to optimize a relationship, you have limited resources. Like, where do we put our time and effort into creating what's considered to be a strategic relationship? So there are methods. This is an ancient method. All the way back to 1983. It's a standard in every procurement and or supply chain textbook. There's a guy called Kraljic that came up with this strategic sourcing matrix, where you decide who your strategic partners are, and you've got some considerations for this. It's similar kind of. There's another one of this that riffs off of this that is used for outsourcing. Like, when do we do outsourcing? When we do insourcing? But that's a different. That's more on the delivery model as opposed to the operating model. So assuming you're using a strategy of competition, there are ways to look at your suppliers and decide, how am I going to treat them? Am I going to treat them as a strategic? Am I going to are they risky to me from a bottleneck or availability perspective? That's a different type of approach than a strategic partner where you're having a long-term relationship. Or on the left-hand side, where you have leverage, you have power. So you're grinding suppliers down there on price, generally speaking. So, and if you look at the axes here, you say the criticality of the item, or how important a particular product or services that you're buying, and how complicated complexity of supply is, just like saying how competitive is this business? How competitive is the market? Are things available? If I do the wrong thing, will I lose supply? So there's multiple versions of these with slightly different axes along the X and Y axis for here. But this is a very common tool and a very easy way to sort of think about your suppliers. If you're ever dealing with one, you're like, well, what do I do in this case? Well, Kraljic. Just try to remember the name Kraljic. And similar to that is once you do this against every supplier or multiple suppliers, you will actually do what's called, either purposefully or accidentally, you will do something called tiering, where your entire supply base will be divided up. Certain percent of them will be considered to be strategic suppliers. A certain group of them will be considered to be suppliers where you're using competitive strategies. A certain group of them are merely tactical, and you will have your entire supply base divided with these labels on them, and anytime you interface with these suppliers, there's a particular strategy for dealing with that supplier that falls into this category of supplier or type of supplier. And this is often called SRM, or supplier relationship management, which is again another tool or capability that can be applied by a well functioning supply chain department or procurement department, if one has only that. So this, and then it all feeds back. So you have your supplier relationship management, and it feeds back into your demand planning and your category planning, which I mentioned earlier, all of your strategic activities, which then go back into your sourcing activity. So the real point behind this slide is just to demonstrate that it's a system. The end feeds the beginning, not just from a life cycle basis, but also from an optimization basis. So you're managing the performance and the relationship, and that goes back to your selection decisions. And it's just hopefully a virtuous circle where your strategies are being supported by the action, and all of that supports the business. So another quick poll, just testing to see if you've seen or heard of these methodologies within your world.
All right, launching the last poll.
Yeah.
So we'll have a few people that drop at 1 because they only had the hour for lunch, but for everyone else, we've got till 1:30 to answer some questions and wrap up the content. So excited that you're able to keep on with us. A couple seconds more for the poll. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, well, that makes sense. Sometimes you're going to see that. The yes being at less than 10% suggests to me that the majority of the group here today is seeing or experiencing a less mature procurement or supply chain context. So, and those of you who are sticking with us at the end of the lunch hour, I do appreciate it. Okay, thank you. And whoops. Oh, we could check for questions here, Jamie, if you wanted to. In particular, anybody who's just about to leave for lunch and wants to get a question.
Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, please add them. So we did have a question about automation trends for supply chain. I was curious about that too. We've got a friend of Amplify, Colleen Pound, that just launched Procure, which is a supply chain technology. And I think, you know, there's obviously a lot of reasons to believe that some of the challenging part of supply chain could be automated, just like any other function. Yep. What are you seeing and what are you expecting when it comes to automation in this area?
I'd say robotic process automation would probably be something that it came to finance first, I think, and now is perhaps being used a bit more in supply chain or in procurement activity, mostly around generating reporting. You know, if you have a ton of data, you might just try to automate some reporting that's useful for procurement decision and also finance decision making. You'll see some automation around payment with sort of smart contracts and smart invoicing, where the human beings taken out of the checking process before payment goes. You'll see some automation around data in terms of data management. The ideal thing would be to create data flows from databases, which then the automation processes the data into something on which a decision can be made. So I've seen that is where it tends to be. You're not maybe around evaluations and reporting tool or evaluations and e-sourcing tools, that sort of thing. There's still, I would say, the procurement functions and or supply chain are probably a little bit behind finance in terms of automation. Would be my view. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but hopefully it does. But I would say RPA was something that's starting to happen more often now.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll let you get back to it and save the rest of the questions for the end.
Okay, sure. Okay, so so I promised, I've done a dose of knowledge about supply chain, and which was part of the promise. And the next part of the promise was to talk about how finance and supply chain can work together. So I've identified a number of areas, certainly not all of them, that in my view are sort of natural areas of collaboration or teaming. Now, whether you can get that to occur or not is a whole different story. I mean, it's one thing to say that it's a fertile area. It's another thing to actually get that teaming to occur. But anyway, so the list that I have here includes this area of environmental sustainability and governance type activity. I do find finance functions and procurement functions have similarly minded people. There's a mindset where it's about governance, it's about stewardship, it's sometimes control, sometimes monitoring, sometimes optimizing decisions based on data. So there is some natural relationship. Also, risk aversity is another one. There's some natural, what I would call almost psychological or character-based similarities between people who work in a finance function, people who work in procurement functions. And so they kind of converge on some of these topics. So again, ESG planning and forecasting, obviously, what I would call risk management generally, but supply chain is really about supply side risk management or market or counterparty risk. Certainly working capital management, there's all sorts of collaboration that occurred in there, assuring profitability and optimizing margins on products and services. And then ethics, which have some things to do with what Jamie was talking about earlier in terms of, bias in the selection decisions and, hiring somebody or places where relationships are close, and what do you do in these situations? So I thought about each area, and I wanted to bring to you, so what is the interest in finance? And I'm not a finance professional, so I'm there's a bit of assumption in here. But there's a number of interests that the finance function tends to have that the supply chain function can support, or a procurement function if you don't have a full supply chain function. So, this again, ESG, risk management, compliance. There's all sorts of new disclosures, and then there's a ton of branding, and all that stuff's interrelated. And oftentimes, the finance function or finance leaders kind of on the hook for some of this stuff at least in terms of compliance. And so, because supply chain functions have that interface with the suppliers, and where suppliers can be a source of risk and failure in the CSG area, there's probably nobody better positioned to manage that than through the procurement decisions that are made and the evaluations of suppliers and through competitive bidding processes that the supply chain function can provide support to this area, not just to finance leaders, but to all of the leaders. But because it's risk management, there's an alignment there with the finance function. Of course, finance is responsible for creating and managing forecasts and budgets, and it's being constantly measured on KPIs, or generating KPIs on how the business is doing from a financial perspective. One of my clients watches operating margin like a hawk, and that's just the nature of their business. They're a mature transportation business, but the supply chain function can provide actually a lot of information, real-time information, that it gets through its interface with the market. No one else has that interface to the market necessarily. Right there, the supply chain is right there in the front lines every day. It understands what's happening in real time in the supply market, what's happening to pricing with market conditions, where they might be going, how they're spending money in real time against budgets, and where you're going to end up. If you spend this much now, what are you going to end up like? What things going to look like in the next quarter? And a lot of the supply chain systems can be the data pulled from them can be used in planning and forecasting activity, and or to really understand the rationality of a given budget or a forecast. Oftentimes, finance in the area of risk management is responsible for being a steward for liquidity risk and counterparty risk, and certainly counterparty credit risk, and certainly On a counterparty credit risk, a lot can be done through the supplier selection process, and then also liquidity, tying that to working capital management and optimizing working capital management as a finance interest. The supply chain can do all sorts of work there to free up capital, and to try to pull, capital is sort of trapped in the supply chain. Supply chain management, good supply chain management, can help free that up, either by optimizing material flows or making sure that inventory levels are appropriate, minimizing logistics delays, so money isn't just tied up in product, it's like sitting in some warehouse somewhere and you can't get out of it. And there's a number of other things that are a little bit fancier, supply chain finance type activity. I haven't talked too much about that, but maybe there's some questions around there. But in terms of when you place suppliers, early discounting, having a relationship with the banks to pay the suppliers earlier for a discount, for example, if you can't get it out of the working capital. There's a number of tactics that can be used. One of the ones that I would caution finance leaders, because it has some negative effects, is this idea of taking longer to pay your suppliers. That's a very common tactic, but that then tends to make suppliers unhappy, and they try to recapture their profitability through all sorts of nefarious activity, like making everything cost. Every time you change anything, it costs you. It can degrade relationships. So that is one that I do see quite often, where there are relationship impacts to paying suppliers slower, and everywhere. In the last 10 years, I've seen payment terms go from 30 days to 60 days to 90 days. So it's getting harder to get paid when you're a supplier, and the only person who's really there to listen to your complaints is the supply chain department. So that is something. Certainly margin integrity, or maximizing margins through adroit marketing or adroit negotiation. Pricing can be optimized without necessarily hurting suppliers. It's not necessarily just sucking all their profits away and slowly killing them, but there are ways to do it that where everybody's doing well and product margins stay healthy, both for suppliers and for the buyer. And then lastly, there's a finance interest in assuring our testing to compliance with the best practices or policies or regulations or laws around ethical activities, mostly around spending money, God forbid, fraud, things like that. And so supply chain can be a partner for implementing auditable controls around supplier selection to weed out bias, and then and also around appropriate spending activity. So the supply chain can implement all sorts of things and do all sorts of things that are in the best interest of the finance function, that can help the finance function really shine and be viewed as being successful and performing. So how do you team? So one of our organization's goals. Sorry, Jamie, you came on. Is there something you want to say?
Oh, I was just going to ask you a couple of questions about training, but I'll let you wrap this up first. Just want to make sure that we get some time at the end to talk about trends and stories.
There's, I think, maybe 2 or 3 slides left here, so we're pretty close to the end. So how do we team? So it's scalable. There's two things that we're trying to do differently. So first of all, there's that whole fractional delivery model in terms of providing supply chain capability, but only to the level that people really, like an organization really needs it. But the other value that we have is this idea of collaboration, which has been painted on the back wall here. And so we're all about how do we get other functions to work with supply chain, or how do we get supply chain to work better with other functions in creating that trust, collaboration, and to become more integrated, to be able to make that movement away from, say, basic and decentralized situations and or maturity models into more structured and integrated, where results tend to be better. You get better margin, lower risk, more certainty where it comes to schedule and or behaviors, and you tend to have better relationships. So we actually have methodology, what I would call collaborative methodologies for creating a better teams or a better relationship or better interface between internal functions within an organization. So some of the things that we try to do, we try to encourage earlier stakeholder involvement, planning, having joint goals or joint planning, doing team building exercises, and purposefully co-locating, sharing of information, and then certainly having the leaders act in a collaborative way with each other demonstrably as an example. So we try to promote this as much as possible in any function that we're supporting, because we know it's going to create value. And we know it's going to create value, and generally also just generates better relationships. People tend to be happier working with each other when they're collaborating. So we're trying to move from what's best from an individual function to what's working for those functions working together to what's best for the organization as a whole. Most people kind of can galvanize around that. So that's really what our business is. We specialize in this medium-sized business area. We're helping people grow their business, so make those changes from decentralized to centralized, or centralized to integrated, things like that, and to help idealize the outcomes from a supply chain in a particular business, and we do that through not just by understanding what small and medium-sized business needs, but we also use this collaboration methodology, which is actually an ISO standard. And we do that through a one team, what we call a one team delivery model. So this is a real standard. This is an ISO standard 44001 on how to have a collaborative business relationship. It applies to your relationships with suppliers, but then also the relationships within internal departments. There's an entire, we've got certification from this, from something called the Institute for Collaborative Working. It's based in the UK. There's a huge movement right now, by the way, out there into collaborative business relationships, mostly with suppliers, but also within internal functions, where, what's the framework, what's the methods, what can you do to create these more collaborative relationships? And so we're suggesting that maybe there's not that many people out there that are in this supply chain business that are trying to create collaborative relationships between finance and supply chain. So that's one thing you could maybe see us as being different, and then we can help you be different with your clients or within whoever Amplify supports into taking this kind of approach, which I think frankly kind of aligns with Amplify's approach to community and having a community of practitioners, which is a unique model as well. So I see some linkage philosophically here. And then lastly, our one team model, so I just want to be sure that everybody understands, it's not just about here's some people who can help you with supply chain. We know this, like we're knowledge experts, we're skill experts, but we also have a process where we're a continuous improvement and engagement with our customers by trying to focus on client satisfaction and generating client satisfaction. And we try to become part of the team. We want to be part of the team. We like to, our contracts are different. They identify shared interests, and which they identify joint goals. Whenever we're dealing with anybody, our engagement model is different, and we try to do a shared risk reward approach as much as possible, so that we're sort of in it with them, and it's not just like a delivery of a service, and this distinguishes what we do from hiring an employee or hiring your average consulting firm or a contractor, that sort of thing. So we like to think that we're taking a different approach that creates value for our customers. So with that, I'll skip the onboarding process in the interest of time, and we'll go to Q&A, and we've got about 10 minutes here. So I think we will end on time.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. So a couple questions about trends, and hoping to hear a few great stories, because that always helps us understand things. In terms of what's happening in supply chain when it comes to just in time versus the other opportunities, what are you seeing, and how does technology or COVID or other world events impact that? Just in time manufacturing, you mean specifically? Well, just as an example, but other methodologies as well. I don't know. I'm kind of a cynic. I think in this area, if a highly disrupted in a context where you have a highly disrupted supply chain, I don't know if just in time delivery
just-in-time approaches are going to be successful, because they rely on people delivering on time, and in many cases, otherwise the whole thing gets just sort of knocked off its pedestal. So I think that just-in-time speaking about it in its past tense. Actually, I just found myself doing that. I find that because the global economic order is a lot less certain, there's a lot more competition. The supply chain's a lot more disrupted. I don't know if just-in-time approaches are going to be successful, because you have to have a very reliable supply chain in order to make that happen. And I don't know whether that reliability can be maintained. So I would say a lot of just-in-time systems are probably at threat, or they're requiring a whole bunch of extra effort in order to maintain that its nature as a just you can't be late, you can't be wrong with quantity. It's very precise, and so too much disturbance might take the precision away from it. So that would be what I would say from as a trend, and how it might impact just-in-time.
And so what about revisiting, if you have a relatively successful or maybe stable business partnership with a vendor or a supplier,
Yep.
What are your thoughts on doing RFPs or going to market on a regular basis or consistent basis? I mean, obviously, we've seen in a number of cases, all of us in various business leadership roles, that add a little competition, and next thing you know, the relationship can get stronger, the pricing can get competitive, and it can really be quite profitable and quite strategic. But on the other hand, it gets transactional, and it really takes advantage of some trust, and doesn't and isn't necessarily aligned with the purpose or the values of many of today's companies. So, how do you balance that, and what kind of best practices would you be seeing, or maybe a story that we could relate to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sad stories about, particularly in public procurement, which is brutal. But there's where people will overuse competition. And that's where it's really about priority of goals. So if you're an organization that values relationships and isn't always chasing the bottom line, then you're going to be into less transactional type relationships. But I have seen many organizations, and I've been on the receiving end of that as well. In business, I'm simply not interested in, frankly, as a supplier, of having organizations just sort of grind you down and push your profitability down to something that's sort of hospital bed breathing device beside you kind of existence for a company. And a lot of companies won't do that for very long. So for example, in I don't know, let's just take construction, for example. In construction, engineering firms, they've been ground down. They just had it. EPCs, they've had it. And right. A lot of them are given these lump sum commercial models. They're like, here, bid on this job. It's EPC. You give me a price. You mess it up. Too bad for you. I know. We're all on the same boat, on the same busy ocean, going up and down and up and down. But I'm going to pretend that your business is not going up and down, and I'm just going to shut off the reality and just protect myself. Those situations, those kinds of businesses, they're saying no. They don't respond to RFPs anymore. And this one's sort of relevant to industrial procurement in Alberta, because it's a lot of EPC type work. Even if it's maintenance and operations type work, it's often attempted to be done on a fixed price basis. So a lot of larger organizations, particularly if they're global, they're just saying no to the work. They don't even bother bidding. And so then the supply chain departments comes back and says, oh, geez, I guess we're going to rethink our strategy. Maybe what happened, what worked in 2012 or 14 doesn't work anymore. We can't live in this irreality of grinding people down on price. So now you're starting to see procurement move more towards a relationship-based approach, more value being placed on stable suppliers and having good relationships. But a lot of procurement people had to learn the hard way. They had to take it on the head from the 2x4 of the market. And because in many cases, people aren't given the latitude to make decisions. The policies constrain them, the goals constrain them. So I would say, to avoid that, you have to be flexible in the kind of and how you measure successful procurement departments, like savings, follow the rules constantly. All these all the minions are going to go out and do that. They're going to generate all these results, tick off all the suppliers, who will then react, and then suppliers, then the buyers react the same, and they change their practices. So in my view, if you have a more strategic relationship where you listen more to suppliers and you have a more of a collaborative approach, you avoid that. And that's one of the reasons why we're emphasizing a collaborative approach, because that lesson has been a hard lesson for a lot of people to learn. And frankly, we think a lot of procurement people and legal and contracts people too actually are programmed to be inflexible. And it just creates all sorts of problems for the businesses that they serve and the suppliers, and it drives pricing up. And suppliers will behave terribly if they think that you're trying to squeeze the margin out of them. They will not deal with it. There's an analogy. This is sort of Zen, but the idea is that you have water in your hand, and the harder you squeeze it, the more water will pour out of your hand. And at the end, if you hold it really tight, you'll have nothing left except for a tiny bit of drops in your palm. So the idea is, that's how I look at the ideal supplier relationship. If you squeeze them too hard, they're just going to run away from you, and they won't do business with you. And it'll be very difficult to be successful as a business.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points, because you certainly still see policies and ideas out there, that they'll grind the suppliers with regular cadence or what have you. And again, it can actually deepen relationships. It can take a complacent supplier to another level, and maybe make sure that all the pricing is being checked to market. But I think a lot of those horror stories that you're speaking of are maybe more common, right? And there's a fine balance of being competitive, of which a supplier is going to want the opportunity to prove that they're competitive, versus being squeezed, like the water analogy. So
Yep.
it's not easy. And I think, a lot of what I'm hearing from you today, despite the opportunities to, automate and streamline and make supply chain modern and current, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a people function
Yep.
at its core. And I think that, those that lead it that way and operate it that way are probably going to have that collaborative advantage. So it's interesting, because one could consider supply chain to be stereotypically a bit more paper driven than people driven, but that's not what I'm getting out of this conversation. So as we're wrapping up, Richard, I'd love to hear just that, that crazy story where you were shocked and surprised, but were able to make a difference. And let us end on that fun story that might make us giggle, but also might make us think. Do you have one for us today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stories. Yes, sure. So there are situations, for example, where sometimes people don't pay, and this is a problem for suppliers, where you do the work and you deliver on time, and the people who are your clients might not just don't want to pay you. Like, say, for example, if a project isn't going well, a large industrial project or something like that isn't going well, they just try to cut their losses, and it won't pay. And then sometimes you can be out millions and millions of dollars that you can't get back, like you've already spent it. So that can happen. It sometimes happens because of these procurement processes that we're talking about, and ruthless supply chain behavior and devil may care what happens to your business kind of approach, not relationship based at all. So one of our clients came to us with this problem where they were owed a huge amount of money, and we were able, through some pretty adroit negotiations and relationship based negotiations, just constant maintenance of communication and just sort of edging forward, we were able to recover not all, but a very significant, like tens of millions of dollars of what would essentially be called a claim, what might otherwise end up in litigation. So that was an extreme situation where the relationship was toast, and there was really, the problem was caused largely by procurement and supply chain practices that were not well performed by people who didn't really care, and we were still able to eke out a success in that barren and hostile environment by using this more collaborative and relationship based approach, and just smart smart communication and negotiation. So we were able to get some of it, not the rest ended up in litigation after all, but we were able to recover, and our clients were very happy and relieved at how fast it occurred with how little effort. One thing I can tell you about collaboration, and maybe this is the takeaway, it is really very inexpensive to implement. It's just a decision. People do all sorts of things, buy new businesses, implement all sorts of technology which costs a huge amount of money to capture value, but it can be captured much more cheaply, in my view, much more easily by simply taking a more collaborative approach in this area of procurement, and we would encourage people to talk to us about that. So I would say, if you could share the screen one last moment here. I don't know if you still can.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, can you see it?
No.
How about now?
Nope.
Okay. So here, let me see what I can do on
While you're doing that, I just
Yeah.
want to remind our members that attended with us today. Nikki posted our Let's Lively Entrepreneurial Talks. So if you're looking for more content or more vulnerable entrepreneur discussions, please take a check out of our video podcast where Jesse and I discuss topics such as cash flow, talent, ERP system selections, navigating business, and much more. So very excited to have that podcast video series, and the link is there for you to subscribe. There's an ebook for every single session, and there's lots of practical and real-time story examples that we try and include in those hour chats. So please take a look and let us know what you think. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, so I did want to end is that if anybody wants to learn more about this, we do provide learning opportunities or training in this area. Because if you call me and you're from the Amplify network, I will do a free coaching call with you if you just want to sound something out. And of course, we appreciate any referrals for our business. If you my BD people will be slapping my wrist if I at least mention this. so referrals for our one team assistants, and if you need to get a hold of me, this presentation will be circulated, and of course here's my phone number, and you can reach us at this email.
Well, thank you. We appreciate your time. It's obviously a hot topic and causing some stress and challenges for many business right now. So it was timely to get you here to help kick off our AHA with Amplify season. So thank you, Richard. Again, members, please note that data analytics is our October session, the third Tuesday. November, we're going to do a cyber session on that third Tuesday. December, we'll skip because you'll be holidaying. And then January, we're back with indirect tax. Again, please become a member and you'll get an opportunity to get the password for our live presentation on October 26th. There's very limited seats for that. And so if you would like to attend, you do need to be a member, and the invite and password will be going out shortly. We really are excited about this chance to help our community with their learning. We'll give CPD certificates, which we know are valuable to the CPAs, and for the business leaders, we know you're trying to achieve your purpose and your strategy every day, and we hope these things help. Have a great day and a great wrap up to your lunch. Thanks so much.
And thank you for